So, when you sent over the source material for today's deep dive, you attached this really interesting little note to it.
Oh yeah, I did. I warned you with a heavy one.
You really did. You mentioned that this specific text, it's a highly detailed lecture transcript from a scholar named G.A. Parwez, given back in 1995.
Right.
You said it completely dismantled your entire understanding of human guilt and this whole concept of the evil self.
Completely dismantled it, yeah.
And after spending, the last week absolutely immersed in these pages, I mean, I totally see your point. We are looking at a framework here that just challenges some of the most deeply entrenched psychological and theological assumptions of our modern world.
Yeah, the arguments laid out in this 1995 lecture, they really do not pull any punches. They ask you, as the listener, to completely reevaluate the architecture of your own mind. And it actually starts with a historical scenario that seems completely counterintuitive on its surface.
Right, so let's set up that scenario for you, the listener.
Sure.
I want you to imagine being locked inside a prison cell.
A dark, literal dungeon.
Exactly. You have been rotting in that darkness for years, serving a sentence for a crime you absolutely did not commit. The entire country believes you are a predator, a criminal of the highest order.
The worst of the worst.
Right. Then, out of nowhere, the heavy iron door swings open. Standing there is an emissary from the king of Egypt himself.
Talk about a plot twist.
Seriously. And he holds a royal pardon. The message is simple. You are free to go, and beyond that, the king wants to offer you a position of high honor in his court.
The keys to the kingdom, basically.
Yeah, the nightmare is over. So what is your immediate reaction?
I mean, most people would trample the messenger trying to get out of that cell. The biological imperative to escape confinement, to find safety and status, it's just overwhelming.
It's pure survival.
Exactly. It's the natural human response to just seek relief.
But the historical figure of Yusuf, who's known as Joseph in Western traditions, he does the unthinkable here.
He really does.
He looks at the open door, he looks at the messenger, and he refuses to leave. He literally rejects the keys to his own freedom.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. He states that he will not accept a pardon, nor will he step foot outside that prison until a full public official inquiry is launched to clear his name, specifically regarding the women who plotted against him.
Yeah, he draws a massive line in the sand.
So the question is, why in the world would someone who has suffered that much, a man possessing immense visionary potential, reject a king's mercy?
Well, to understand the sheer magnitude of that refusal, we really have to dissect the political and psychological power dynamics that the text outlines.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the emissary's offer is explicitly framed as an act of royal mercy. And while that sounds really benevolent to a modern ear, in a legal and structural context, accepting mercy is actually a deeply compromising act.
How so?
Because if you accept a pardon, you are tacitly agreeing to the premise that you required a pardon in the first place.
Oh, wow. I've never thought about it like that.
Right. You are accepting the label of a convicted criminal who just caught a lucky break. You enter the king's court with a massive asterisk next to your name, forever.
You're forever the guy who got away with it.
Exactly. And the author points out that Yusuf's refusal is this ultimate assertion of moral authority over just, political expediency.
Right.
If Yusuf walks out of that cell on the basis of mercy, he becomes a permanent subordinate to the king's narrative. His reputation remains stained.
So he'd have no real power.
Exactly. Any policy he tries to implement, any leadership role he assumes, it could be immediately undermined by political opponents. They would just remind the public, hey, remember, this man assaulted the minister's wife and the king merely let it slide.
Right, they'd have leverage over him forever.
Yeah. Yusuf recognizes that true leadership requires absolute moral clarity. He flat out refuses to build a foundation on a structural lie.
So he essentially tells the emissary to go back to the palace and demand the receipts.
Basically, yeah.
He forces the state to investigate the wife of the Aziz, the Egyptian minister, and the gathering of women who fabricated all those charges. He gambles his entire freedom on the demand for objective truth.
And the gamble actually succeeds. The king is forced to order the inquiry. The women are brought forward, and the investigation culminates in the complete confession of the Aziz's wife.
The ultimate vindication.
Totally. The text highlights her exact admission. She states unequivocally that Yusuf is innocent, that he never engaged in any wrongdoing, and that the entire plot was her own unjust creation. The truth is officially cemented right there into the state record.
Okay, but here is where it gets really interesting, and where the source material introduces a detail that completely changes how this story has been interpreted for centuries.
Yeah, this part blew my mind.
When the Aziz's wife confesses, does she just say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? The author points out that she uses a very specific justification for her actions, something that has been wildly misinterpreted ever since. What exactly does she say?
So, during her confession, which is recorded in Surah Yusuf, verse 53, she attempts to explain away her own unethical behavior by using the Arabic phrase Nafs-e-Ammara.
Nafs-e-Ammara.
Right. In English, this is frequently translated as the self that commands to evil or the commanding self.
The self that commands to evil. I mean, that sounds incredibly authoritative.
It does, and it sounds authoritative because for centuries, various cultural, ascetic, and mystical traditions have quoted that specific phrase as if it were a universal divine decree.
Like it was a rule of the universe.
Exactly. It became a foundational concept to argue that God placed an inherent demonic force inside the human psyche, like a tiny devil that constantly whispers and commands humans to commit evil acts.
But the text reveals the monumental irony here. That phrase isn't God speaking.
No,
It isn't a prophet delivering some timeless truth about human biology.
not at all. It is the literal quote of the minister's wife trying to save face after being caught in a massive lie.
It's just her excuse.
Yes, she is the one saying it. The author, Parwez, is adamant about correcting this historical misattribution. She is essentially saying, well, yes, I orchestrated this terrible plot, but you see, the human self just naturally commands people to do bad things. I couldn't help it. It's just human nature.
It is literally the oldest excuse in the book. It's the ancient equivalent of the devil made me do it.
Yeah, precisely.
She is trying to diffuse her personal guilt by claiming her flaw is actually a universal biological trait. She's taking her own individual failure and projecting it onto the entire human race.
And the tragedy here, according to the text, is that this pathetic excuse uttered by a human attempting to evade personal responsibility was somehow lifted completely out of its context.
And turned into doctrine.
Exactly. It was codified into a certified theological doctrine about the inherent wickedness of the human soul. The author views this as a devastating error that has fundamentally poisoned how humanity views itself.
Because if we peel back that layer and realize the Nafs-e-Ammara, this supposed internal demon, is just an excuse from a flawed politician's wife, it shatters an incredibly heavy psychological burden.
It really does.
The idea that we are broken from the factory is just a paralyzing concept.
Yeah, the source material spends significant time tracing the roots and consequences of this pessimistic view of human nature. The author compares this misunderstanding to earlier theological traditions. He specifically outlines the concept of original sin found in Christian theology and certain older Israeli traditions.
Let's look at how the text frames that comparison, because it uses original sin as sort of the ultimate foil for its own argument.
So, the text describes the doctrine of original sin as the belief that humans are born inherently sinful, that you're carrying an ancestral stain from the exact moment of birth.
Right.
And because this stain is congenital, the individual is deemed entirely incapable of washing it away through their own moral choices or good deeds. Their personal agency is fundamentally insufficient.
So if the flaw is baked into the motherboard, no amount of software updates can fix it. You are doomed by your own hardware.
That's a great way to put it. And the author outlines the logical conclusion of that paradigm. If you cannot save yourself because your nature is inherently corrupted, then you are entirely dependent on an external savior or an atonement sacrifice.
Right.
The text points to the belief in the crucifixion, this idea that an external party had to pay the ultimate price to wash away this congenital sin purely because humanity was utterly powerless to do it themselves.
And the source material lays that out specifically to reject it, yes. It draws a very hard line in the sand regarding human agency.
An absolute line. The text argues forcefully that within its Quranic framework, humans are not born sinners. Yeah. There is absolutely no ancestral stain.
None at all.
God did not place a destructive, evil entity inside our minds. The author states that any philosophy claiming a human is born inherently sinful is completely incompatible with the concepts of divine justice and true free will.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we remove the concept of an inherent demon and we reject the idea of an ancestral stain, we are left with a very practical problem.
Which is?
People still do terrible things.
True.
Societies commit atrocities. Individuals lie, they cheat, and they steal. If there is no evil self driving us, what actually causes this behavior?
No.
What is this commanding self if we strip away all the supernatural baggage?
To answer that, the author introduces a profoundly rational, evolutionary perspective. He explains that human life did not just manifest out of thin air. It evolved through extensive animal stages.
Okay.
And as we ascended from a lower state of physical existence into the stage of humanity, we brought our legacy hardware with us.
The biological baseline, the basic operating system required just to keep a physical organism breathing.
Exactly. The text refers to this as our physical life. These are our fundamental biological instincts. The relentless drive to eat, to drink, to seek shelter, to protect ourselves, to reproduce, and to dominate potential threats.
The survival instincts.
Right. For millions of years, these urges were the sole mechanisms keeping our ancestors alive. They are incredibly potent.
Well, they have to be potent. I mean, if a creature lacks a fierce drive to consume calories or reproduce, its genetic line ends immediately. It's game over.
Exactly. And the text asks us to observe how these drives function in the animal kingdom. For an animal, satisfying these urges is a purely biological equation. There's absolutely no moral dimension attached to it whatsoever.
Right.
When a starving lion hunts and kills a deer, no rational person accuses a lion of committing evil. It is just fulfilling its biological imperative.
Because the lion lacks an ethics committee, it only has physical boundaries.
Yeah, the author uses the example of a starving herbivore to illustrate these physical boundaries.
Yeah.
A sheep or a cow will not consume meat, regardless of how intensely it is starving.
Right, it physically can't.
It will literally die of malnutrition before it violates its physical programming. It cannot choose to become a carnivore. The action is biologically impossible. Animals possess no moral boundaries, only physical ones.
The lion isn't maliciously choosing to end a life, and the sheep isn't taking some moral stance on pacifism. They are just executing the code they were born with.
Precisely. Then, we reach the human stage of evolution. At this point, humanity receives a monumental upgrade. We are no longer solely governed by physical instincts. We are endowed with free will.
The game changer.
Completely. The text calls this irada and ikhtiyar, which is the power of intention and conscious choice.
It's the capacity to observe our own programming and actually decide whether to engage it or suppress it.
Yes, and with the advent of free will, a completely new architecture of boundaries is required. We don't just face physical limits anymore, we face moral limits.
Right.
The text introduces the concepts of halal, that which is permitted, and haram, that which is forbidden. These represent the ethical boundaries of human behavior.
Wait, okay. If I can push back on that for a second. It's easy to say animals don't have morals, but let's look at an extreme human scenario. If a human being steals a loaf of bread because they are quite literally starving to death, is the text classifying that as evil simply because a boundary was crossed? Doesn't that framework kind of lack empathy for the human condition?
That's a really important question. The text actually handles that distinction by separating the biological urge from the method of execution.
Okay, how so?
The urge itself, that agonizing hunger, is entirely neutral. It is just your legacy hardware screaming for survival. The author does not condemn the hunger.
Right, the hunger isn't the sin.
Exactly. The moral failure, the evil, occurs in the specific choice to bypass the ethical boundary to satisfy that hunger. A human must navigate moral limits. They must earn sustenance legitimately, not expropriate the labor of another.
Even when it's hard.
Even in extreme distress, the presence of free will means a choice is being made.
So, the Nafs-e-Ammara, when properly defined, is just a human being using their free will to satisfy a basic biological urge by actively choosing to smash through a moral limit.
Yes.
It is the primitive brain grabbing the steering wheel and just ignoring the rules of the road.
That is the exact mechanism. The author strips away all the mysticism. The commanding self is simply unchecked biology. There is no external power forcing a person to commit a wrong.
It's all internal.
Completely. The text emphasizes that if someone holds a weapon to your head and forces an action, you have not committed a moral failing because your agency was removed. But when you act freely, the choice to transgress is yours alone.
Okay, but if evil is nothing more than unchecked biology and our primitive brain acting up, we hit a massive theological roadblock here.
Which is?
Where does the concept of Satan or Iblis fit into this entirely rational framework? Because the figure of Iblis is central to these ancient narratives. Is the author suggesting Satan is just a metaphor?
The author profoundly redefines the concept. He transitions Iblis from a literal external monster whispering in our ears into a complex psychological state.
A psychological state? Wow.
Yeah. Specifically, the text defines Iblis as a state of deep rebelliousness, coupled with paralyzing despair.
Despair is a really fascinating word choice there. Normally, Satan is associated with arrogance, pride, or malice. Why despair?
To understand the linguistic and psychological use of despair, the text contrasts the tale of two monumental mistakes, the error of Adam and the error of Iblis.
Okay, let's look at those.
Both figures receive a direct command, and both figures fail to uphold it. The critical difference lies entirely in their reaction to their own failure.
Right, because Adam breaks the rule, and his immediate reaction is extreme ownership. He says, we have wronged ourselves. He doesn't look for a loophole.
And by taking absolute personal responsibility, Adam preserves his ability to reform. If you acknowledge that your flawed decision-making caused the problem, you retain the power to improve your decision-making in the future.
That makes sense.
Now, observe Iblis. Iblis violates the command to bow. But instead of demonstrating remorse, he actively searches for a scapegoat.
Right.
He deflects the blame upward, essentially telling God, you created me out of fire. You put me in this position. You made me do this.
He constructs a narrative of victimhood. It's not my fault. It's the system. It's my environment. It's how I was wired.
Exactly. And the author identifies this deflection as the core pathology of blame. A human enters a satanic state when they cross moral boundaries and absolutely refuse to own their actions.
They just point fingers at everyone else.
Right? They point fingers at their parents, their society, their genetics, or fate itself. And here is where the concept of despair becomes clear. The word Iblis linguistically stems from the root of despair.
Because if you never admit that you are the author of your mistakes, you are powerless to rewrite your future. You are just trapped.
You resign yourself to a perpetual cycle of failure because you believe the locus of control is entirely outside of you. That is ultimate psychological despair. You become hopeless because you refuse to acknowledge the one thing you can actually change, which is yourself.
That reframes the entire concept of demonic influence. Being influenced by Iblis isn't about supernatural possession, it's the psychological dead end of surrendering your own agency.
The text highlights a moment where Iblis declares he will lead humanity astray. The divine response there is critical. It says, you will have no authority over my sincere servants. This means the state of Iblis possesses no coercive power. It only affects those who willingly hand over their agency and choose the comfort of victimhood over the heavy burden of responsibility.
The source material actually includes a quote attributed to Prophet Muhammad that perfectly encapsulates how we are supposed to handle this internal tension. I'd love for you to bring that in because it completely changes the goal of spiritual discipline.
Yeah, the author cites a really well-known tradition where the prophet states to his companions, everyone has a Satan attached to them, even me.
Which is a shocking thing to hear.
This revelation naturally shocks his audience, prompting them to ask how that could even be possible. And he responds, yes, but I have made my Satan a Muslim.
A Muslim.
Right, and in this context, Muslim means submissive or surrendered.
Meaning he hasn't annihilated his biological drives, he has subjugated them. This completely mocks the ascetic traditions that demand people go live in a cave and starve themselves to achieve purity.
Oh, the author fiercely critiques those ascetic models. He argues that attempting to kill your desires is not only impossible, it is actually destructive to your humanity.
Because you're fighting biology.
Exactly. If you attempt to destroy your need for sustenance, you become obsessed with food. If you try to annihilate your ambition, it mutates into bitter resentment. The goal is not the destruction of the legacy hardware.
Right, you don't take a hammer to the engine just because it's loud. You learn how to steer the car.
That's a perfect analogy. The biological urges the Satan attached to us, they provide the essential energy for life. Making those urges submissive means placing your free will and your higher moral reasoning firmly in the driver's seat.
So they serve you instead of you serving them.
Yes. The urge to accumulate resources, when tamed by moral boundaries, builds thriving economies. The urge to reproduce builds families and societies. You give the urge a boundary, you do not destroy it.
Okay, but if our primary task is steering this primitive engine and keeping it within boundaries, we need an incredibly reliable navigation system.
We do.
We need an alarm that sounds when we drift over the line. And that brings us to what we commonly call our conscience.
The text refers to this mechanism as the Nafs-e-Lawwama, the reproaching self. It is that sinking, heavy sensation in your chest when you commit a wrong.
And we hold a very romanticized view of this feeling, don't we? We tend to view the conscience as a flawless, divine moral compass implanted in our souls, speaking the objective language of the universe.
Right, that's the common assumption.
But the author introduces a terrifying plot twist regarding where this voice actually comes from.
It is deeply unsettling. The text dismantles the notion of an inherent divine conscience completely. The author argues that the Nafs-e-Lawwama is a completely manufactured entity. He uses a very specific phrase to describe it. He calls it society internalized.
Society internalized. This means the voice in your head isn't an angel. It's literally just an echo chamber of the culture that raised you.
Exactly. A newborn infant possesses no functioning moral conscience. It only has physical demands. The conscience is constructed over years, piece by piece, by parents, educators, media, and the surrounding environment.
So it's programmed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whatever the society labels as good, the child's developing conscience logs as righteous. Whatever the society labels as shameful, the conscience programs as a source of guilt.
I mean, I see how that works in theory, but in practice, doesn't everyone feel bad about the big things like murder or theft? If we think about the conscience like an immune system, a healthy immune system attacks actual diseases. Are you saying society can program our moral immune system to attack the wrong things, or worse, ignore actual diseases?
The author provides deeply unsettling examples to prove exactly that. He demonstrates how environmental programming can become so entrenched that it triggers extreme physiological reactions.
What kind of reactions?
He asks us to consider a child raised in a strict Hindu vegetarian household where consuming meat is taught not as a dietary preference, but as a profound spiritual contamination.
Okay. So the taboo is written into their deepest code.
Yes. If that individual inadvertently consumes something containing meat, perhaps a soup flavored with bone broth, and later discovers the truth, their reaction is not a mild sense of regret.
Yeah.
Their Nafs-e-Lawwama reacts with such overwhelming force to this internalized violation that the person will literally physically vomit. The psychological programming forces a biological rejection.
Wow. And there is zero objective biological law stating human stomachs cannot process bone broth.
Exactly.
The illness is generated entirely by the socially installed guilt. The immune system is attacking a peanut because it was taught the peanut was a deadly virus.
And the text pushes this concept further into much darker territory to show what happens when society praises objective evil.
Oh, this part is chilling.
The author brings up the historical example of the Thuggee. These were the tribes of highwaymen in India who believed that strangling and robbing travelers was a sacred act of devotion to the goddess Kali.
A society operating in a completely inverted moral universe.
Imagine a young man raised in this tribe. From infancy, he is taught that murder is not a crime, but a heroic duty. The most revered figures in his world are the most prolific killers.
Right.
So when this young man commits his first murder, the myth of the universal divine conscience suggests he should be paralyzed by an inherent sense of guilt. But the chilling reality, as the author points out, is that his conscience does not reproach him at all.
His conscience actually validates him.
Yes.
It floods his system with a sense of societal belonging and profound pride. He feels he's become a man.
It proves that the conscience is an empty vessel. It merely enforces the rulebook it was handed. If a society normalizes an atrocity, the Nafs-e-Lawwama of its citizens will defend that atrocity without a second thought.
The author also gives a more subtle, everyday example of how easily this programming shifts over time, right?
Right.
It's less dramatic than the Thuggee, but almost more relatable for the listener.
Yeah, he reflects on the social norms of his own youth. He notes that decades ago, a young boy walking in public without a head covering a cap or turban was considered deeply disrespectful.
Right, a major faux pas.
If a boy went bareheaded, he would face severe reprimands from his elders. The boy's conscience would sting. He would feel genuine burning shame over a missing piece of fabric.
But the author looks at the modern landscape and notes that the rules have just evaporated. Today, no young man feels a shred of guilt walking outside without a hat. The biology hasn't changed, God hasn't changed. The only variable is the cultural programming. So, if our conscience is just a cultural download that can be programmed to celebrate murder or cause physical illness over a bowl of soup, then we have a massive philosophical crisis on our hands. How do we ever know if the guilt we feel is actually justified or if it's just our society manipulating us?
The author confronts this crisis directly. He distinguishes between what society provides, which is merely relative good and relative evil, and what humanity actually requires to survive.
Relative morality is terrifying because it shifts depending on which side of a border you stand on or what decade you happen to be born in.
The text points out the inherent instability of determining morality through a 51% majority vote in a parliament. If morality is subject to public opinion, it is entirely fluid.
Right.
A society can collectively vote to marginalize a minority group, and within a generation, the societal conscience will adjust to feel absolutely zero guilt about that oppression.
Because it's the new normal. To avoid that kind of moral chaos, we need an anchor. We need a standardized unit of measurement that doesn't expand or contract based on the weather.
The author argues for the necessity of absolute good and absolute evil. And logically, if humanity is constantly shifting and subjective, this absolute standard cannot be generated from within the human intellect.
It has to come from outside.
It must originate from an unchanging external source. Within the author's Islamic framework, this source is divine revelation.
It is the vault containing the standard meter stick. You need that external, immutable birthline to check your societal rulebook against.
Exactly.
But here's the practical challenge. If the absolute standard is locked in a book, but my internal conscience is being actively programmed by my flawed environment every single second of the day, how do I actually get the absolute standard inside my head?
The text provides a deeply psychological solution to this problem. It places the ultimate responsibility for moral architecture firmly in the hands of the mother.
Ah, the concept of the mother's lab.
Yes. The author quotes the philosopher Allama Iqbal to emphasize this point. Because the Nafs-e-Lawwama is constructed during the earliest, most formative stages of cognitive development, the mother's lap serves as the first and most dominant society a child experiences.
So the mother is quite literally the creator of the conscience.
Precisely.
And the text uses a specific historical practice to illustrate how this programming is supposed to begin, right? The whispering of the Adhan.
Yes. The author points to the tradition of whispering the Adhan, the call to prayer, which begins by declaring the greatness of God into the ear of a newborn immediately after birth. He argues this was never intended to be a hollow ritual.
It was functional.
It was a calculated psychological intervention.
It's the installation of a baseline operating system. The mother is whispering, before the chaotic world tries to tell you what to value, I am setting the core code. There's an absolute authority greater than whatever relative nonsense society will try to sell you.
And the author laments that this profound responsibility has often decayed into mere tradition, losing its intentionality. If a mother does not actively and aggressively program the child's conscience with absolute values, she leaves the child vulnerable.
Vulnerable to the world.
Vulnerable to absorbing whatever shifting relative ethics the broader society decides to inflict upon them.
So we are caught in a crossfire. We have the primitive brain, the legacy hardware pushing up from below with intense biological demands.
Right.
We have the conscience pressing down from above, often filled with flawed, shifting societal programming. Living in that tension sounds absolutely exhausting. How does a human being ever achieve actual peace?
The resolution of that agonizing tension is the final psychological stage detailed in the text. It's called Nafs-e-Mutmainna, or the satisfied self.
The balanced personality, but the text is very aggressive in defining what this peace is not.
Oh, very aggressive. The author sharply critiques the methods many people employ to seek spiritual peace. He specifically calls out individualistic Sufi asceticism.
The idea of just withdrawing from the world.
Right, the practice of retreating to a mountaintop, isolating oneself in a dark room, and engaging in repetitive chanting to numb the mind.
Because escaping the noise might feel peaceful temporarily, but it doesn't actually solve the tension. It just pauses the game.
Exactly. True peace, which the text calls idmanan, is not the avoidance of conflict. It is the decisive resolution of it.
So how does that look?
The balanced personality is achieved when your biological urges, your free will, and the absolute divine laws fall into perfect alignment. You reach a state where the agonizing internal debate of, should I do this or not, ceases to exist.
The friction is gone.
Your will is so entirely submitted to the higher law that the temptation loses its friction.
And to see what this actually looks like under pressure, the text brings us full circle back to the story of Yusuf, specifically focusing on the event that landed him in prison in the first place. This is where we see what the author calls the engine of reason in full effect.
Yeah, the source material analyzes the moment Yusuf is alone in a locked room with the wife of the Aziz.
Yeah.
He is a young man in his prime. His primitive brain, his biological legacy hardware, is fully capable of responding to the situation.
There's no physical barrier.
There are no physical barriers preventing him from acting.
The urge is present. The Ammara is active.
But the text notes the total absence of internal agony. Yusuf does not spend hours wrestling with his conscience. His engine of reason, his deeply ingrained, immediate vision of the absolute moral law overrides the primitive brain instantaneously.
Isis knows.
And the author redefines the concept of zikr, or remembrance, using this exact moment.
Because true Zikr isn't sitting safely in a mosque chanting syllables.
True zikr is extreme situational awareness. It is possessing the absolute clarity of divine law at the precise critical moment of temptation, and allowing that clarity to instantly dictate your choice without internal resistance.
Wow.
Yusuf's reason governed his biology perfectly.
And this brings us back to our starting point, Yusuf in the prison cell, refusing the pardon. We understand now why he didn't run out the door. He was operating from that state of Mutmainna.
He possessed the absolute truth of his innocence. He knew that accepting mercy violated that truth.
There was no internal debate.
None. The absolute right choice was clear, regardless of the physical cost of remaining in a cell.
He was entirely immune to the political and biological pressures that would have broken an unbalanced mind. And this leads to the text's final crucial argument, right? This level of mastery, this balanced personality, cannot be cultivated in a vacuum.
No, you cannot achieve it by hiding.
Right.
The author insists that morality is fundamentally relational. If you are alone in a jungle, you cannot steal, you cannot lie, you cannot oppress, and you cannot uplift. You are neither moral nor immoral, you are merely existing.
So morality requires other people.
The state of Nafs-e-Mutmainna requires engaging with the friction of the real world.
Which perfectly sets up what happens next in the historical narrative. Yusuf doesn't clear his name just to go retire on a quiet farm somewhere.
No, quite the opposite.
Because he is a min completely trustworthy and a master of himself, and because he is alim deeply knowledgeable and technically proficient, he is appointed to the highest levels of government. He is the scientific appointment.
He takes the absolute truth he has internalized and uses it to design a massive societal framework, a nizam-e-rububiyat.
And what does that mean, practically?
It means he builds a system to literally save the population from a devastating famine. He builds a system of universal nourishment.
The individual achieves internal balance so they can step out and balance the world. This entire deep dive has been a staggering paradigm shift. I mean, we began with a prisoner refusing a pardon, and we ended up dismantling the architecture of the human mind.
We replaced the myth of an inherent demon with the reality of our biological legacy hardware.
We recognize that our conscience, rather than being a pure divine voice, is often just an echo of the society that programmed us. And we learn that true peace isn't found in isolation, but in aligning our choices with absolute truth amidst the chaos of reality.
Based on the profound frameworks we've explored today, I'd encourage everyone listening to begin a habit of internal auditing.
I love that. Internal auditing.
Next time you feel a wave of guilt or hesitation, pause and interrogate it. Ask yourself, is this feeling anchored in an objective standard of right and wrong? Or is my socially programmed Lawwama simply reacting to an arbitrary cultural norm? Separate your true moral compass from mere societal conformity.
That level of self-awareness is the first step toward genuine freedom. And to leave you with one final thought to pull on long after this deep dive ends, the text leaves us at the precise moment Yusuf is preparing to step out of that prison, having mastered himself, ready to reshape an entire nation.
A visionary with power.
Exactly. It makes it clear that true inner peace is inextricably tied to the health of the society you live in. So if your own psychological balance and the conscience of the next generation are entirely dependent on the world around you, what are you doing today to shape the conscience of your community?